Good afternoon, I'm Miss Young and this is the first video in a playlist which is all related to finding and correcting errors in pseudocode. Now, these questions come up on any exam board, and although the pseudocode or the code, how the code is written, the language is written, might change, the process for finding and correcting errors is essentially the same for any similar question on any exam board question. So how should we go about addressing this question? Well, it may seem obvious, but the first thing to do is to read the question, and like any question, you should underline anything that you think is important. So this pseudocode should allow 500 marks to be entered. If the mark is 80 or greater, it's stored in an array for higher marks. If the mark is less than 80 but greater than or equal to 50, it's stored in an array for middle marks. And so actually seeing that now, I can see that higher and middle, because the remaining marks are stored for lower marks. And so now that we have that information, that might give us a clue as to how we might go about it. So how do you go through this methodically? Well, I like to deal with it in a number of different ways. I first like to do what I call matching pairs. And we want to look for things like, if we have a repeat, then we need to see an until. If we have a while, I'm sure you've guessed it, we need to see an end while. If we have a for, then we need a next, preferably with a variable. If we see a if, then we want to see an end if. And if we have a case, we want to see an end case. So these are what I call the matching pairs. Then we will go with what I call repeating patterns. Looking for repeating patterns, and if we look at these patterns that are repeating and something seems different between one or all of them, then that will give us a good hint as to what might go or be wrong. Then what I have is what I call variable mismatch, and then I'm going to write this down here and I'm going to say logic errors. And these are the ones, these four come up the most, but there are a couple that come up less obviously, but we need to know about them, and that is what I call data type. So if, and they haven't done it in this case, but if they decide to declare a variable, so to say declare high lists integer, for example, you should be looking for what I call data type errors. So these are only when we have declaration, and then we have what I call variable initialization. Initialization. I can't spell today, but hopefully you can read initialization. And those are ones to look out for. And so now that we have those in our head, let's have a think about applying them. So let's start with matching pairs. So do we have any of these repeat, while, for, if case? Well, we have here, we have a repeat. So we'll be expecting at the same indentation level an until. And we don't get that, we get a next. So either line 22 is wrong or line number 5 is wrong. So if this was a next, we would expect this to be for and then an assignment 1 to some value. So it looks very unlikely that this next is correct, but also we would have next mark entry and it would not be a condition. So we can be very confident in saying that this should be until. So the first one is line 22 and we need to change. What do we need to change? We need to change next to until. I've got limited space, so I'm just going to put a line down here because we've got 4 of these to find. And so we can then look, do we have any more matching pairs? Well, we have an if, and we have an end if, which is what we want, and we have an if, and we have an end if, so that's what we want. So we seem to be okay for matching pairs. So now we want to look at repeating patterns, and we can see, hopefully, that we have this high list, middle list, and so these 3 seem to be doing the same thing, except obviously, as we know from the question, we've got an array that holds the higher marks, an array that holds the middle marks, and an array that holds the lower marks. So can we see a difference? Well, hopefully you can immediately see that we've got mark, and marks entry. And so something looks suspicious, and in fact we're entering the mark, and it's the mark that we want to store. Marks entry appears to be a totaling value because we're adding 1 to it every time. So this is wrong, and this should simply be marks. So the error is on line 9, and we want to change marks entry to mark. Now, sticking with the repeating patterns, we can see that we have a high list is high list plus 1, and a low list is low list plus 1. And so we'll be expecting a mid list is mid list plus 1. Of course, we want to increment how many times, how many entries we've got in the middle array every time. So we can see here, again, from matching patterns, that this seems to be wrong. And so we can say that is on line 15, and we want to change. What do we want to change? We want to change to add plus 1. Now let's stick again with repeating patterns. We've got higher, high list, makes sense. Middle, mid list, makes sense. And lower, we would expect that to be low lists. And that seems to be wrong because we want to store the value at, or the index of low list of lower, we want to store the mark. So we can see here that that line is, that should be low list, and that is on line 17. So in 17 we can change high list to low list. But let's just imagine we hadn't spotted some of those. Well, we can also think about now is variable mismatch. So we have low and high, that seems to be a mismatch. So we could have caught that one just as easily on variable mismatch. And so it's important that some of these, if you go through this in a methodical fashion, if you miss it here, it's possible that you will get it here. And again, it's a logic error. Well, mid list, it would be logic. It wouldn't. This wouldn't work because we keep putting it into the same array index. So that would be an issue with how this is working. And so that hopefully answers this question. That will give us 4 out of 4. But even for Cambridge, if we managed to find just 3 of those, that would give us an A. So let's look about, when you attack these, remember to go through and underline important things. Think about these matching pairs, repeating patterns, variable mismatch, any logic errors, and then particularly if we have got declarations, a data type error, and then variable initialization. They happen mostly with what I would call min, max, totaling, because it might set the value to be a high number, or counting. Again, it might set the value to be 100 when it should be 0. So when you see things like min-max algorithms, or when it's counting, then variable initialization is one to look for. And so hopefully that has been a little bit of help on how to answer that. I'm Miss Young, and hopefully I will see you later.